Back in the 1990s, FAIR founder Jeff Cohen and Norman Solomon wrote a column, The Martin Luther King You Don't See on TV. It noted how the timeline in media's story seems to jump from 1965, marching for voting rights in Selma, to King's assassination in Memphis in 1968. Because national news media have never really come to terms with what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for during his final years, when he challenged the country's fundamental economic and international priorities, when he opposed the war in Vietnam, when he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. As Joseph Torres of the group Free Press wrote just recently, sanitizing King's legacy is a deliberate act. Well, that sanitizing is reflected not just in what media don't talk about when they talk about King, but also in how they present those things they do discuss. Any holiday roundup, for example, will include footage from the 1963 I Have a Dream speech. The narrative there, put simply, is of a fractious country brought together by the sheer force of King's moral eloquence, universally recognized and appreciated. It wasn't really much like that at all, as CounterSpin discussed with Gary Young in the summer of 2013, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Gary Young is New York correspondent for The Guardian and author of the book, The Speech, the story behind Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. We asked him about the preeminent misrememberings or misunderstandings of King's words that day.
I think the first one is that significant powers, the main powers in the country, did not want the march to take place, and without the march there wouldn't have been a speech. Kennedy didn't want it to take place. Most Americans thought that the march was a bad idea, and an overwhelming majority of white Americans thought that the country was moving too quickly towards civil rights. There is this sense that there was a group of bad guys in the South, bad white people, with sticks and dogs, and that everybody else was basically on board. And that's just not the way it happened. So there's that. That everybody knew as soon as that speech was delivered that it was a speech for the ages and that it struck a chord immediately. I mean, it was a great speech. I haven't heard anybody who was there say it wasn't a great speech. Kennedy greeted King saying, I have a dream, and was looking at the march on a TV in the Oval Office and said, damn, that man can speak. It moved people. It certainly moved people. But you ask anybody who knew King well, anybody who's in the movement, did you think we'll be speaking about this speech 50 years later? They all say no. While the speech was lauded immediately by New York Times and others, it actually kind of fell from public view. Very few people quoted it. It wasn't quoted in the congressional records, barely at all, even though there was a Voting Rights Act and a Civil Rights Act. And King became more unpopular in the years following the speech. He moved on to poverty and the Vietnam War, and these things got him in an awful lot of trouble, and he died an isolated figure. It was only after he'd been assassinated that the dream was resurrected, and over the years became polished and gleaned to become a national icon. So it's not as though history goes through the collection of speeches that are available and says, this one is the best one objectively. I like his diction, I like his metaphors, and so on. America has chosen to remember this speech because it does something very particular for America in this moment.
You make a point of the fact that, our listeners may know that how media ignore King's anti-war stance and his emphasis on economic restructuring. I remember David Gergen, the pundit, expressing confusion and dismay that Hillary Clinton chose to use a remembrance of King as a time to mention poverty. He thought it was just out of place. But you make the point that even his views on racism have been misunderstood, and it's just this fact of segregation, which King was acknowledging, the end to, but he didn't believe that segregation and racism were the same thing and that racism ended with segregation.
Well, right. This is the very useful illusion of the conservatives and the right, is to use segregation as a foil for racism and to say that racism is now finished. because segregation is finished. At the march on that day, A. Philip Randolph said, of course we want equality, but gaining entry to these establishments will do us little good if we do not have the money to buy anything there. And so the end of segregation, which was a major achievement which should not be undermined or undersold, it meant the end of the most explicit form of racism that could exist. But it didn't mean the end of racism, and King never, ever thought it did.
King's legacy has been instrumentalized toward a number of ends. Pundits have argued that he would have supported wars in regions around the world. But the most popular conservative appropriation might be that because he said people should be judged by the content of their character, King would have opposed affirmative action. Despite the evident weakness of the idea that the person who called for a radical redistribution of political and economic power was opposed to affirmative action, it's been tossed out for years by the likes of David Horowitz and Charles Krauthammer as proof that King was in fact a conservative. An early observer of the phenomenon, Paul Rockwell, noted that when Louisiana Governor Mike Foster signed an executive order abolishing affirmative action, he presented that as the fulfillment of King's dream. Oh, you say, but that was way back in 1995. But nope, it's 2017, and the Washington Post editorial headline reads, Martin Luther King Jr. was a true conservative. And that's because, quote, in his way, Dr. King did a lot to preserve, protect, and defend the best of our principles and values. Just as Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was despised by many conservatives of his day, helped keep American society from succumbing to the radical ideologies that brought death and devastation to much of Europe and Asia, Dr. King worked to turn back extremism, violence, and racial nationalism at the height of the civil rights movement, and to keep the cause of essential and long overdue change in the American mainstream. Close quote. As fair analyst Adam Johnson noted, the Post's false dichotomy in which King, or their version of him, represents the good left, unmoved by racial nationalism and Marxist ideology, is just the same tired take, erasing the King that said in 1961, quote, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children, close quote.